call lasted 4 seconds. 6 words, whispered so quietly I almost mistook them for static. "Please don't let him hurt me." Then the line went dead, and my whole world changed in the space of a single breath. My name is Frank Ellison. I'm 69 years old, a retired Marine Corps gunnery sergeant, a widower, and the father of 1 daughter. I've spent a lifetime around danger, and if there's one thing I learned from it, it's this. Real fear doesn't shout. It whispers. Because the people who are truly terrified are usually trying not to make things worse. The moment I heard my daughter Claire's voice on that call, I knew she wasn't asking for comfort. She was asking to survive. And right before the line cut out, she said one more thing, so soft I almost missed it. 2 numbers and a letter. 714. Most people would have shrugged that off as nothing. I couldn't, because those numbers meant something only she and I understood. 15 years earlier, after I came home from my last overseas posting, I taught Claire a set of code phrases, something she could use if she was ever in trouble and couldn't speak freely. She thought it was silly. She laughed and called me overprotective. I laughed with her, but I also made her promise that if she ever used the real code, I'd come without asking a single question. She had just used it for the first time in her life. I didn't call her back. Someone standing next to her might answer instead. So I grabbed my truck keys with one hand and dialed 911 with the other, already moving toward the door. My dog, an old yellow Labrador named Bo, lifted his head from the floor the second I stood up. He knew something was wrong before I did. The dispatcher picked up almost instantly. "What's your emergency?" I was already starting the engine. "Possible domestic assault. My daughter's in danger." "Sir." "What's the address?" I gave it from memory. Her house was barely 12 minutes away. "Are you sure someone's with her?" "I'm sure." "Please stay away from the residence until deputies arrive, sir." I looked through the windshield at the empty road ahead. "I can't do that." Her voice sharpened. "You could make things worse." "If I'm right," I said, "waiting is what makes it worse." There was a pause. Then she asked if I was armed. I told her the truth. Yes, a handgun, locked in my truck, and no, I wasn't bringing it inside unless a life was on the line. That wasn't bravery talking. That was 30 years of discipline. I'd learned a long time ago that the first person to lose control in a crisis usually loses everything else too. Rain started falling as I drove, harder with every mile. Every red light felt like it lasted an hour. I kept hearing Claire's whisper on a loop in my head. "You spend your whole life believing you'll always be able to protect your child. Nobody warns you how helpless it feels when that child is 36 years old, married, living in her own house, and still calling you with the same fear she had during thunderstorms when she was 6. I hadn't always trusted my instincts about her marriage. 3 months before that phone call, if you'd told me I'd end up pinning my own son-in-law to a kitchen floor, I would have laughed at you. Marcus Doyle didn't look like a dangerous man. He was 38, charming in that polished salesman kind of way. He ran a high-end boat dealership outside town and carried himself like someone who believed his success made him right about everything else. When Claire brought him home 4 years earlier, she was smiling again for the first time since her mother died. That mattered more to me than anything he said or did in front of me. After I lost my wife Diane to cancer, I'd watched my daughter go through the motions of living without actually living. Then Marcus showed up, and suddenly she had color in her cheeks again. Hope, I've learned, can blind you just as easily as love. We lived in a small coastal town in Oregon, the kind of place where everyone waves in the grocery store parking lot and pretends every family is as happy as it looks on a Sunday morning. People knew me as the quiet old widower with the beat-up truck and the yellow lab. I fixed lawnmowers for neighbors, drank black coffee at the diner every Thursday, and tended the garden Diane used to love. Nobody asked much about my time in the service. I liked it that way. The past had taken enough from me already. The first real warning sign came at Thanksgiving, 2 years before that terrible night. Claire had spent all afternoon cooking her mother's old recipes, nervous because it was her first time hosting alone. The turkey came out a little dry, nothing anyone would remember a week later. Marcus took one bite, chewed slowly, and announced to the whole table that it was a good thing she was pretty, because cooking clearly wasn't her strength. A few people chuckled politely. Claire laughed too, but not because it was funny. She laughed to make the moment end faster. Everyone else watched her smile. I watched her shoulders. They tensed the instant he opened his mouth, the same way I'd seen young recruits tense right before an officer started yelling. Small movements tell the truth long before words ever do. I told myself I was reading too much into it. Every marriage has its awkward jokes. I wanted that to be true, so I believed it. But then Christmas came, and he mocked the sweater she wore for making her look older. Easter arrived, and he humiliated her in front of the whole family over a forgotten bag of ice. At every gathering, he interrupted her stories, corrected details nobody cared about, and somehow always managed to make the room laugh at her instead of with her. None of it seemed serious enough on its own to cause alarm. That was exactly the problem. Cruelty rarely shows up all at once. It creeps in slowly until the people around it stop noticing it's even there. And every single time, Claire responded the same way. She smiled. She apologized. She changed the subject. One Saturday in July, I hosted a backyard cookout. Nothing fancy, just burgers and lawn chairs under the trees. Marcus showed up already smelling of whiskey under his cologne. Halfway through the afternoon, while I stood at the grill, he wandered over with a beer in hand and announced, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, that I was the quietest old veteran he'd ever met. Maybe, he said, because I never actually did anything worth talking about. I just flipped another burger and said, retirement teaches you to enjoy the quiet. He wasn't satisfied. He kept pushing, telling everyone Claire acted like her father was some kind of hero, but he'd bet I spent my whole career doing paperwork. Claire stepped in and told him to stop. He waved her off without even looking at her. I gave him nothing. No anger, no reaction. And that, more than any argument could have, seemed to frustrate him. A few minutes later, Claire followed me into the kitchen to grab more plates. As she reached for a bowl, her sleeve slipped back, and I saw a dark bruise circling her wrist. I asked her what happened. She froze, pulled her sleeve down fast, and told me it was nothing. She wouldn't look at me. It wasn't the bruise that scared me. It was the fear behind her eyes. In all my years in the service, I learned one lesson that never failed. People can hide an injury. They almost never hide fear. That was the moment I stopped wondering if something was wrong, and started wondering how much I had already missed. For weeks afterward, I tried to convince myself there was an innocent explanation. A door, a fall, anything. But once I stopped looking at each incident alone and started looking at the pattern, the truth was impossible to ignore. Marcus didn't insult Claire because he lost his temper. He did it because he enjoyed watching her apologize for things that weren't her fault. Every conversation ended the same way. He got louder. She got smaller. One evening that fall, alone in my garage with Beau asleep at my feet, I dug through an old storage chest from my service days. Buried under photographs and medals was a laminated card, the code list Claire and I made together when she was 16. She'd rolled her eyes through the whole thing, insisting this wasn't a spy movie. I laughed along with her, but still made her memorize it. Most of the codes were harmless, ways to get picked up from an awkward party without making a scene. Only one carried real weight. If she ever used 714, I was to stop asking questions, call the police, and come to her immediately. We never spoke of it again after that day. Life moved forward. She graduated, got a job at the local library, got married, and I figured she'd long since forgotten those silly codes. Then, around midnight on an ordinary Tuesday, my phone buzzed on the workbench. A text from Claire. "Dad, can you find Mom's peach cobbler recipe? 714. Everything in me went still. The recipe didn't matter. What mattered were those 3 characters sitting at the end of her message. She hadn't typed them by accident. Training took over before panic could. I grabbed my keys, unlocked my gun safe, checked the chamber, and secured the weapon in a lockbox under my truck's back seat. I wasn't bringing it because I wanted a fight. I was bringing it because a prepared man plans for the outcome he hopes never comes. Then I called 911 and started driving, the dispatcher's warnings fading into the background noise of rain against the windshield. By the time I reached Claire's subdivision, lightning was cutting across the sky. Most of the houses were dark. Hers wasn't. Every light downstairs was blazing, and even before I got out of the truck, I could hear shouting. I parked across the street instead of pulling into the driveway. Old instincts. A direct approach announces you. Watching first tells you if you're already too late. I left the gun locked exactly where it was. My goal wasn't to punish Marcus. My goal was to bring my daughter home alive. I crossed the wet lawn at a steady pace, forcing myself not to run. Because panic narrows your vision and training widens it. Near the kitchen window, I heard glass shatter against a wall, followed by a short, sharp cry, the kind of sound a person makes when pain arrives before they can brace for it. Through the gap in the curtains, I saw Claire pressed against the counter, blood at the corner of her mouth, broken dishes scattered across the floor around her bare feet. Marcus stood inches away, red-faced and shouting, pointing at her like she was to blame for every failure in his life. Then he grabbed her wrist and shoved her hard into the cabinet behind her. Something in me went completely calm. Not angry. Calm. I moved toward the half-open patio door without a sound. He hadn't noticed me yet. Claire had. Her eyes lifted over his shoulder, and for one instant, relief broke through the terror on her face. She mouthed one word. "Dad." Marcus laughed without even turning around, telling her to go ahead and call me, that her old man couldn't save her now. I stepped through the doorway. He's already here. He spun around, swaying slightly, and grinned like I'd just walked into a party instead of a crime scene. I didn't answer him. I only looked past him long enough to make sure Claire could still stand. Then I looked back and said the only thing that mattered. "Step away from my daughter." He laughed again, took 2 slow steps closer instead of backing off, and told me this wasn't my house, wasn't my marriage, and she wasn't my little girl anymore. Then he shoved me with both hands. That was the decision that ended everything. His weight shifted forward before his balance caught up. I caught his wrist, redirected his momentum, and guided him to the floor in one motion. No punch, no kick, just leverage and control, exactly the way I'd been trained decades earlier. He hit the hardwood stunned, and I secured his arm behind his back before he even understood what had happened. Behind me, Claire slid down against the counter, shaking. "Dad," she whispered. "You're safe now," I told her, without taking my eyes off him. 30 seconds later, red and blue lights washed across the windows, and 2 deputies came through the front door with weapons raised. I kept Marcus pinned, hands visible, and told them calmly that the victim was behind me and the suspect was secured. The older deputy studied my posture, my breathing, the way I held the restraint, and asked quietly if I'd served. "Retired Marine Corps," I told him. He nodded and looked toward Claire, who, split lip and shaking hands, answered every other question in the room. After the paramedics treated her and the deputies drove Marcus away, still shouting that everyone had betrayed him, the house went painfully quiet. Claire didn't pack a bag. She just grabbed her purse, slipped on her shoes, and walked out beside me. That was the moment, looking back, when she finally accepted she wasn't coming back to that house. At my place, Beau was waiting at the door. He walked straight to Claire and rested his head against her leg before she even said a word. And she dropped to her knees and cried harder than she had all night. Animals don't ask uncomfortable questions. They just know when someone needs comfort. The next morning, over coffee, she apologized to me. "For what?" I asked. "For bringing all this into my life," she said. That single sentence told me more about how long Marcus had controlled her than anything else could have. I told her the only thing that disappointed me was that she'd carried this alone because she thought I couldn't handle it. Then she finally told me everything. It hadn't started with hitting. It started with small corrections in public, criticism about her clothes and her cooking, and slowly the belief that no one else could ever understand her the way he did. 3 days later, a detective named Lauren Marsh came by to go over the case. Claire, nervous, finally pulled a small flash drive from her purse. She'd been recording their arguments for the past 8 months, hiding the recorder inside an old recipe box that used to belong to her mother, the one thing Marcus never thought to open. The recordings were damning. His voice, calm and charming one second, vicious the next. In one clip, drunk and furious, he threatened that if her father ever interfered in his marriage, he'd make him regret it. Detective Marsh told her plainly that documenting abuse didn't make her disloyal. It made her alive. 6 weeks later, at the preliminary hearing, Marcus's attorney tried to paint me as the aggressor, a man who took the law into his own hands. Then the prosecutor played the deputy's body camera footage. Marcus, screaming and resisting while I held him without striking a single blow. Claire, shaking, blood on her mouth, telling the deputy through tears that yes, she was hurt. The medical reports showed he had no lasting injuries. Claire's showed bruising, cuts, and older wounds consistent with months of abuse. When she took the stand, the prosecutor asked her why she hadn't left sooner. She said it was because she'd stopped believing she could survive without him. Then she looked at me and said her father hadn't told her she should have left sooner, hadn't lectured her about strength. He'd simply come when she called. "My father saved my life," she said, and the courtroom went completely silent. At the sentencing hearing weeks later, I wore my old dress uniform for the first time since Diane's funeral. Standing there beside Claire, I finally understood why. It wasn't about reminding anyone who I used to be. It was about reminding my daughter that the man beside her had never stopped protecting his family. When the judge asked if I wanted to speak, I stood and told the court that experience doesn't teach a man how to fight. It teaches him why fighting should always be the last resort. I told Marcus directly that I hadn't come to his house to defeat him. I came to stop him before he destroyed someone else's life. Real strength, I said, isn't measured by how afraid people are of you. It's measured by how safe they feel when you're in the room. Marcus was sentenced to prison time, mandatory counseling, and a permanent protective order. Before the deputies led him away, he turned and told Claire he was sorry. She didn't answer. She just took my hand and held on until the doors closed behind him. The months that followed weren't easy. Claire still checked the locks twice before bed. She still flinched at unfamiliar trucks. But slowly, she found her footing. She moved into a small apartment above a flower shop downtown, signed the lease herself, while I stood beside her without touching the pen. She went back to work at the library, where nobody treated her like she was broken. Just ordinary kindness. And it was exactly what she needed. My own life changed too. A retired buddy finally talked me into joining the weekly breakfast at the Veterans Hall, where nobody needed me to be the man I used to be. And my grandson Tyler, 10 years old and full of questions, started spending weekends at my place. One afternoon by the lake, he asked if I really threw his father to the floor with one hand. I told him his mother exaggerates. Then he asked why his dad had been mean to his mom. And I told him some people confuse love with control. He asked if that's what being strong means. I told him no. Real strength makes people feel safe when you're near them. A few weeks after that, Claire got a letter from Marcus, postmarked from the correctional facility. She almost didn't open it. When she finally did, we read it together. No excuses, no blame. Just an admission that he'd confused control with love and fear with loyalty, and that counseling had forced him to hear his own lies coming out of other men's mouths. Claire asked me if I thought he meant it. I told her remorse is only real when it stops asking for forgiveness and starts accepting consequences. She asked if I could forgive him. I told her I didn't hate him, because hate keeps you tied to someone long after you should have let go. But forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It just decides not to let the past choose who you become next. A month later, our family gathered for Sunday dinner. Fried chicken, cornbread, and Diane's peach cobbler recipe finally made the right way. Claire laughed more that evening than she had in 3 years. And it wasn't the forced smile she used to wear to convince everyone she was fine. It was real. Looking back over almost 70 years, I've learned that strength isn't about winning fights. It's about answering the phone when someone you love whispers that they're afraid. It's about protecting the people who matter without letting anger take the wheel and giving them a safe place to heal once the danger has passed. If this story leaves you with one thing, let it be this. Never ignore the quiet signs that someone you love is asking for help. Sometimes the bravest thing a frightened person can do is whisper. And sometimes the greatest responsibility we carry is making sure that whisper is never ignored. If this story moved you, hit like, drop a comment, and let us know where you're watching from. And subscribe to Aftermath Tales so you never miss the next one. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.